The morning mist rolled across the Blue Ridge Mountains on a September day in 1895, clinging to the valleys below like silk draped over stone, and through that mist rose something that should not have existed in North Carolina, should not have existed anywhere in America, really, a French Renaissance chateau so vast and so impossibly detailed that even the architects who designed it wondered privately if they had gone too far. The Biltmore estate stood complete at last, all 175,000 square feet of it, with 250 rooms spread across limestone walls that glowed pale gold in the morning light, surrounded by 125,000 acres of forest and gardens and farmland that stretched as far as the eye could see. George Washington Vanderbilt too stood on the front terrace that morning, watching the sun burn away the mist, and he was 33 years old, unmarried, the youngest grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had died the richest man in America, and he had just finished building what would become the largest private residence ever constructed in the United States. The cost had been staggering, approximately $7 million, which translates to roughly $240 million in today's money, and George had paid for every dollar of it from the inheritance his grandfather and father had left him, from the railroad fortune that seemed so vast it could never run out. He believed he was building something permanent, a home his family would occupy for generations, a monument that would prove the Vanderbilts were not just rich but cultured, not just powerful but refined. He was wrong about almost everything. But on that September morning, before the future arrived with its bills and its problems and its slow, inevitable erosion of everything George had built, there was only beauty. And the beauty was overwhelming, intentional, expensive beyond anything most Americans could imagine. The house itself was modeled after three French chateaux, Blois, Chenonceau, and Chambord, combined and enlarged and adapted to American scale, which meant bigger, grander, more elaborate than any European original. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, considered the finest in America, who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and understood that George wanted not just a house but a statement, architecture that would silence anyone who called the Vanderbilts mere merchants who had gotten lucky. Hunt delivered exactly that, a structure with a facade longer than 2 football fields, with towers and turrets and carved limestone details that required master craftsmen imported from Europe because American workers lacked the necessary skills. The statistics were almost absurd. 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, 3 kitchens, a bowling alley, an indoor swimming pool, a gymnasium, a library that held 22,000 volumes, a banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling where the Vanderbilt family crest was carved into oak paneling alongside the words, "From great industry, great fortune." That last phrase was revealing, almost offensive, as if the Vanderbilts needed to remind visitors that their wealth came from work rather than aristocratic bloodlines, even though the work in question, railroads, shipping, finance, had often been ruthless and exploitative in ways George preferred not to examine. The entire estate employed approximately 80 servants full-time, people who lived in designated sections of the house or in estate buildings, whose labor made the fantasy of chateau life possible in the mountains of North Carolina. If you're still listening to this, still following the construction of this impossible dream, you understand that what we're examining isn't just architecture but the psychology of wealth trying to prove something. These investigations take months of research, and your presence here makes them meaningful. The decision to build in North Carolina rather than New York or Rhode Island, where most Vanderbilt properties were located, came from George's particular vision of what wealth should accomplish. He had visited Asheville in 1888 for health reasons. He suffered from chronic respiratory problems that the mountain air supposedly helped, and had fallen in love with the landscape, the dramatic views, the sense of isolation from the industrial cities where his family's fortune had been made. He began purchasing land, acre by acre, farm by farm, until he controlled a territory larger than many European principalities. The purchases were not always voluntary. Local farmers found themselves receiving offers they understood were not really negotiable, prices that seemed generous but came with implicit pressure from a family that owned railroads and could make life difficult for anyone who refused to sell. The estate George envisioned would be more than a house. It would be a self-sustaining world, a complete universe of agriculture, forestry, and gentleman farming that would demonstrate how enlightened wealth could improve the land and the people on it. He hired Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, to manage scientific forestry on the property. He hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had designed Central Park, to plan the grounds and gardens. The message was clear: this was not vulgar display but cultured improvement, wealth deployed in ways that benefited society. That at least was the story George told himself and others, and it was partly true, though it conveniently ignored the question of why social improvement required a 250-room mansion for one man. Construction began in 1889 and continued for 6 years, employing approximately 1,000 workers at peak periods. The wages were fair by local standards. Skilled stonemasons earned between $2.50 and $4 per day, roughly $75 to $120 in contemporary purchasing power, but the work was dangerous and exhausting. The construction site had its own railroad spur to bring in materials. Limestone was imported from Indiana. Oak and walnut came from the estate's own forests but required specialized milling. The stone carving alone took years, with craftsmen working from drawings Hunt had commissioned showing every detail of the decorative elements that would cover the exterior. 3 workers died during construction, their names recorded in payroll ledgers but not memorialized anywhere on the property. They were building someone else's dream, and their deaths were considered unfortunate but inevitable costs of ambitious construction projects. The interior was where George's vision became most clear and most problematic. He had traveled extensively in Europe, purchasing art and furniture and tapestries and books, and he filled the Biltmore with treasures that belonged in museums. Paintings by Renoir and Sargent. Tapestries that had hung in European castles. Furniture that had been owned by royalty. A chess set that supposedly belonged to Napoleon. The library contained first editions and rare manuscripts worth millions. The banquet hall featured a triple fireplace so large that grown men could stand inside it, carved from limestone with details that would take hours to fully examine. Every room was a statement, every object carefully chosen to communicate sophistication and education and taste that went far beyond mere wealth. But here was the problem George couldn't quite solve: all this culture and sophistication required an army of invisible workers to maintain. The 80 full-time servants were organized into strict hierarchies: butlers and footmen, housekeepers and maids, cooks and kitchen staff, groundskeepers and stable hands, maintenance workers and engineers who kept the heating and electrical systems running. They lived in the estate, worked 6 days a week, earned annual salaries ranging from $200 for the lowest positions to perhaps $1,200 for senior staff, amounts that translate to roughly $6,000 to $36,000 in today's money. These were decent wages for domestic service, and George considered himself a good employer, but the very structure of the arrangement required that these 80 people devote their lives to maintaining the comfort of one man and whatever guests he chose to invite. The servants' quarters were located in the basement and attic sections, deliberately separated from the main living areas by a complex network of stairs and corridors that ensured staff could move through the house without being seen by family or guests. There were separate servants' dining rooms, servants' bathrooms, servants' sitting areas, a complete parallel world existing within the same structure but carefully segregated. The architectural message was clear: these people were necessary but should remain invisible, present enough to provide service but absent enough not to disturb the fantasy of effortless luxury. Before we continue deeper into this world, ask yourself what invisible really means. How many people does it take to make one person's life look effortless? And what happens to those people when the money runs out? George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898, 3 years after the house was completed, and they had one daughter, Cornelia, born in 1900. The family used the Biltmore as their primary residence, occupying perhaps 30 rooms of the 250 available, leaving vast sections of the house essentially unused except when entertaining guests. The operating costs were staggering even by Vanderbilt standards, approximately $250,000 annually, which adjusts to roughly $7.5 million today. That figure included staff salaries, maintenance, utilities, taxes, insurance, supplies, and the agricultural operations that were supposed to make the estate self-sustaining but never quite managed it. The farms lost money. The forestry operations lost money. The entire estate functioned as a spectacular money furnace, consuming hundreds of thousands of dollars yearly while producing nothing except beauty and the satisfaction of owning it. George's wealth, though enormous, was not infinite. His inheritance from his father's estate had been approximately $10 million, $300 million in today's currency, which seemed like a fortune that could sustain anything. But the Biltmore's construction had consumed $7 million of that, and the operating costs meant another $250,000 disappeared annually. George had investments that generated income, but not enough to cover the estate's appetite. By the early 1900s, barely a decade after the house was completed, the financial strain was becoming apparent. George began selling assets, art, rare books, some of the land he'd accumulated. The sales were quiet, handled through dealers and auction houses, structured to avoid public attention that might suggest the Vanderbilts were struggling. The irony was brutal and precise. George had built the Biltmore partly to escape the railroad business that had created his family's fortune, to demonstrate that Vanderbilts could be gentlemen farmers and cultured patrons rather than industrial tycoons. But gentleman farming and cultural patronage, it turned out, required constant capital infusion. The railroads generated wealth. The chateau consumed it. And George, having separated himself from the family businesses, lacked the income streams that would have been necessary to sustain his vision indefinitely. The financial pressure intensified after 1907, when a banking panic triggered a broader economic crisis that reduced the value of George's investments and made it harder to generate liquidity from asset sales. He was not poor, even in difficulty. The Vanderbilt baseline was millions of dollars, but he was no longer wealthy enough to maintain the Biltmore at the level he'd envisioned. Staff cuts began. Rooms were closed off to save heating costs. The agricultural operations were scaled back. The estate that was supposed to demonstrate enlightened wealth instead began demonstrating the limits of any fortune that wasn't actively being replenished through business activities. George died suddenly in 1914 during an appendectomy in Washington, D.C. He was 51 years old. The official narrative emphasized his cultural contributions and the magnificent estate he'd created. The financial reality was more complicated. His estate, after debts and obligations were calculated, was worth approximately $7 million, a substantial fortune but barely half what his father had left him, and most of it was tied up in the Biltmore itself, an asset that generated no income and required constant capital expenditure. Edith inherited everything, along with the problem of what to do with an unsustainable monument. If this dynamic feels familiar, if you're recognizing patterns in how fortunes evaporate despite starting from positions of extraordinary wealth, your awareness is exactly what makes these stories important. Edith Vanderbilt was 39 years old when George died, left with a teenage daughter and a house that was bleeding money faster than the estate could generate it. She was smart, practical, more financially literate than George had been, and she immediately understood that something had to change or the Biltmore would consume everything and leave Cornelia with a famous name and no actual wealth. The operating costs remained around $250,000 annually, now adjusted to approximately $6 million in contemporary currency, and the estate's income from forestry and agriculture covered perhaps a quarter of that, meaning the gap had to be made up from George's investment portfolio, which was no longer large enough to sustain indefinite losses. Edith's first move was staff reductions. The 80 full-time employees were cut to approximately 45, with various positions eliminated or consolidated. The housekeepers had to cover more rooms. The groundskeepers maintained smaller areas, letting some sections grow wild. The kitchen staff was reduced, meaning fewer elaborate meals and less entertaining. These cuts saved perhaps $40,000 annually, barely denting the overall shortfall but necessary nonetheless. The servants who were let go received their final wages and brief references and disappeared into the local economy, where jobs were scarce and former domestic workers struggled to find equivalent employment. Their names appear in payroll records up to certain dates, then vanish, leaving no trace of what happened to them after the Vanderbilt household decided it could no longer afford their labor. The second move was selling land. Edith began divesting the outlying parcels, keeping the core estate but selling thousands of acres to the federal government, which was establishing what would become Pisgah National Forest. The sale generated immediate capital, approximately $5 per acre, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars for the land George had purchased a generation earlier, and also reduced property tax obligations on the remaining acreage. It was smart asset allocation, preserving liquidity while divesting property that generated costs without corresponding income. But it also meant abandoning George's vision of a vast estate that would function as its own world, reducing the Biltmore from a principality to merely a very large house. The First World War brought additional challenges. The economy shifted toward war production. Luxury seemed inappropriate. The Vanderbilts, like other wealthy families, faced social pressure to demonstrate restraint and contribution to the war effort. Edith closed additional sections of the house, donated to various patriotic causes, reduced entertaining to minimal levels. The Biltmore during the war years was a ghost of what it had been during George's lifetime, most rooms closed, most staff gone, the machinery of luxury largely shut down to conserve resources and avoid criticism. Cornelia Vanderbilt came of age during this period, growing up in a house that was simultaneously extraordinary and obviously struggling, learning early that vast inherited wealth was not the same as financial security, that monuments required feeding and that the food was running out. She married in 1924, a society wedding held at the Biltmore that briefly returned the estate to its former glory, full staff hired temporarily, all rooms opened and cleaned, the kind of entertaining George had envisioned but which had become increasingly rare. The wedding cost approximately $100,000, roughly $1.5 million today, an amount that seemed justified for the Vanderbilt heir but which further depleted the estate's capital reserves. Cornelia and her husband, John Cecil, inherited the Biltmore when Edith died in 1958, and they immediately faced the same problem that had plagued Edith, an enormous house requiring enormous operating costs with no corresponding income source. The post-war American economy had changed fundamentally. Income taxes and inheritance taxes, which had barely existed when George built the Biltmore, were now substantial. The estate tax on Edith's death consumed a significant portion of the remaining liquid assets, forcing art sales and additional land sales to cover the obligations. The operating costs had actually increased despite earlier cuts, as inflation pushed wages and maintenance expenses upward while the estate's income-generating capacity remained minimal. The solution Cornelia and John ultimately pursued was radical but increasingly necessary, opening the Biltmore to paying tourists. The idea of turning the family home into a public attraction was profoundly distasteful by traditional Vanderbilt standards, an admission that the family could no longer afford to maintain the property privately, that the monument George had built for his personal use now required thousands of strangers paying admission fees to remain solvent. But the alternative was worse, losing the property entirely, either to foreclosure or forced sale to developers who would likely demolish the house and subdivide the land. The Biltmore opened for public tours in 1930, with admission priced at $2 per person, roughly $35 in today's money. The early years of tourism generated modest revenue, enough to cover some operating costs but not enough to fully sustain the property without continuing to draw down capital reserves. The house that George had designed for invisible servants now had visible tourists walking through bedrooms and banquet halls, examining the art and furniture and architectural details that had been meant for family and select guests. The transformation was complete. The Biltmore had become a museum of itself, a preserved monument to Gilded Age excess that could continue existing only by commodifying the very privacy and exclusivity it had been built to provide. These stories continue only because people like you engage deeply enough to support serious investigation. If this changed how you see the relationship between wealth and sustainability, between monuments and maintenance, your awareness extends the meaning beyond one family's chateau. The financial mechanics of running the Biltmore as a tourist attraction were more complex than simply charging admission. The house required constant maintenance, roofs leaked, stone eroded, wooden elements deteriorated, mechanical systems needed updating. Every repair was expensive because everything was custom and historical, requiring specialists and historically appropriate materials. The gardens needed full-time groundskeeping. The paths and roads needed maintenance. Insurance costs were astronomical. Property taxes on the remaining 8,000 acres, the estate had been reduced from 125,000 acres through decades of sales, remained substantial. And tourism itself created additional costs, staff to manage visitors, marketing expenses, facilities for tourists, liability insurance, compliance with building codes and accessibility requirements. The breakthrough came in the 1960s and 70s when William Cecil, Cornelia's son, took over management and professionalized the tourism operation. He treated the Biltmore not as a family home that happened to allow visitors but as a business that happened to be housed in a historic property. He expanded the attractions, adding a winery in the 1980s that generated revenue from wine sales and tastings. He improved the visitor experience with better interpretation and amenities. He invested in marketing, positioning the Biltmore as a destination rather than a curiosity. The strategy worked. Annual visitors increased from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to eventually over 1 million per year, with admission prices rising to $40, then $60, then $80, then over $90 per adult ticket in recent years. The Biltmore today is a case study in financial adaptation. It operates as a for-profit business owned by the descendants of George Vanderbilt, generating annual revenues estimated at over $100 million from admissions, wine sales, hotels built on the property, restaurants, and retail operations. The estate employs approximately 2,400 people, vastly more than the 80 servants George employed, though serving a different purpose, catering to tourists rather than one family. The employees earn modern wages, receive benefits, work under conditions regulated by labor laws that didn't exist in George's time. The transformation from private residence to tourist attraction preserved the physical structure but completely changed its meaning and function. But preservation came at the cost of the original vision. George built the Biltmore as a home, a private world where cultured wealth could exist in beauty and isolation. It has become a public commodity, a destination where 1 million strangers annually pay to walk through rooms that were designed to exclude strangers, where the intimacy and privacy that George valued have been sacrificed entirely to the financial necessity of generating revenue to cover operating costs. The house survived by abandoning everything except its physical structure. The vision died completely. The question of what happened to the Vanderbilt fortune more broadly is inseparable from the Biltmore's story. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, died in 1877 as the richest man in America, with a fortune estimated at $100 million, approximately $2.5 billion in today's currency. His son William doubled that fortune through railroad investments, leaving $400 million, roughly $10 billion today, when he died in 1885. That wealth was divided among his 8 children, with George receiving approximately $10 million as the youngest son, while the bulk went to the 2 oldest sons who continued managing the family businesses. But by the 1970s, fewer than 100 years after the Commodore's death, no Vanderbilt appeared on lists of America's wealthiest people. The fortune had been dissipated entirely through a combination of estate division, extravagant spending, poor investments, and the simple arithmetic of wealth dilution across generations. When a fortune is divided among children, then divided again among grandchildren, then again among great-grandchildren, the per capita amounts decrease exponentially unless the wealth is actively being replenished through business operations or investments. The Vanderbilts after the first generation were largely not engaged in wealth creation, only wealth consumption, and consumption eventually exhausts any finite resource, even one that initially seems infinite. The Biltmore exemplified this dynamic. George spent $7 million building it and hundreds of thousands annually maintaining it, drawing down capital rather than deploying it productively. Had he invested that $7 million at even modest returns, the compound growth over decades would have created a fortune sufficient to maintain the estate indefinitely. Instead, he converted liquid assets into an illiquid monument that consumed resources perpetually. The choice was understandable. He wanted beauty and legacy, not more money, but the financial consequences were inevitable. Fortunes that aren't actively managed and grown eventually disappear, regardless of their initial size. The deeper question is what George was really building and why. On the surface, the Biltmore was about establishing the Vanderbilts as cultured American aristocracy, proving they belonged among European nobility, demonstrating that American wealth could create beauty equivalent to anything in France or England. But beneath that was something more personal and more sad. George was the youngest son, the one who hadn't inherited business responsibilities, the one who was free to pursue interests and passions rather than continue building the family empire. The Biltmore was his attempt to prove that his path, culture, beauty, refinement, was as valuable as his brother's path of business and empire. He was trying to justify his existence, to show that the Vanderbilt who didn't build railroads still mattered, still contributed something important. The house says yes, you mattered. But the financial collapse says something more complicated, that mattering requires resources, that beauty and culture are expensive luxuries that only sustained wealth can support, that walking away from the businesses that generated the fortune meant eventually losing the ability to maintain the lifestyle the fortune had made possible. George was right that there are things more important than money, but he was wrong about whether those things can exist without money, at least at the scale he envisioned. The servants who made the Biltmore function, those 80 full-time employees and the hundreds of construction workers before them, exist in the historical record primarily as expenses. Payroll ledgers list names and amounts. Occasional photographs show servants in the background of family pictures, carefully posed to be present but not prominent. A few oral histories collected decades later capture fragments of their experiences. But mostly, they're invisible, just as they were designed to be, their labor-enabling luxury while their lives remained unexamined and unmemorialized. The Biltmore today includes some interpretation of servant life, showing the servants' quarters and explaining the hierarchy and daily routines, attempting to acknowledge the human foundation on which Gilded Age luxury rested. But the acknowledgement is retrospective, educational rather than corrective, recognizing past invisibility without fundamentally questioning the systems that produced it. If you've stayed with this story through its financial collapse and uncomfortable questions about whose labor builds whose dreams, you're demonstrating the kind of sustained attention that makes deeper understanding possible. That matters more than you might think. One servant whose story partially survived was a housekeeper named Emma Reed, who worked at the Biltmore from 1902 until 1925. An oral history interview conducted in 1968, when she was 91 years old, provides rare first-hand perspective on what life was actually like for staff. Reed described the work as hard but fair, saying George Vanderbilt was kind and Edith Vanderbilt was exacting but just. She earned $16 per month initially, approximately $480 in contemporary currency, working 6 days a week, with Sundays off unless there were guests, in which case Sunday became a workday with supposed compensation through a different day off that often didn't actually happen. Reed's responsibilities included cleaning approximately 20 rooms daily, making beds, changing linens, dusting, maintaining fireplaces, and assisting with serving meals when the regular dining room staff were overwhelmed. She lived in an attic room she shared with another housekeeper, sleeping in narrow beds that had been purchased as surplus from a hotel. The room was cold in winter despite the house's elaborate heating system, which apparently didn't extend to servant areas with the same effectiveness it served family spaces. She ate meals in the servants' dining room, food that was good but consisted of simpler preparations than what was served upstairs, the difference communicating hierarchy even in cuisine. The most striking element of Reed's testimony is her description of invisibility as actual job requirement. She was instructed to move through certain corridors only at specific times when family members were unlikely to be present. If she encountered a family member unexpectedly, she was to press herself against the wall and avert her eyes until they passed. She was never to speak unless spoken to, never to make eye contact, never to show any reaction to conversations she overheard or situations she witnessed. The training in invisibility was explicit and enforced, with the head housekeeper conducting drills where maids practiced moving silently and positioning themselves to be maximally unobtrusive. Reed worked at the Biltmore for 23 years, from age 25 to 48, the prime of her life devoted to maintaining rooms for a family that never learned her name. George Vanderbilt apparently never spoke to her directly in all those years. Communication came through the head housekeeper. Edith Vanderbilt spoke to her occasionally, always in the form of instructions or corrections. Cornelia, growing up in the house, was taught not to acknowledge servants except when absolutely necessary. Reed's invisibility was so successful that she existed in the house for over 2 decades essentially as a ghost, present but unperceived, working but unacknowledged. When she left in 1925, dismissed during one of Edith's staff reductions, she received 2 weeks' pay and a brief letter of reference. No farewell party. No acknowledgement of 23 years of service. Just a letter stating she had been employed and her work had been satisfactory. Reed's story is important not because it was uniquely terrible. By the standards of domestic service in that era, the Vanderbilts were relatively good employers, but because it was completely typical. This was how the system worked. This was what enabled a family of 3 people to occupy a 250-room house and maintain it to standards of perfection. You needed an army of invisible workers who devoted their lives to tasks that were immediately undone and required repeating endlessly, who accepted wages that were barely adequate, who agreed to be seen only when seeing them was convenient and to disappear the moment their presence became noticeable. The beauty of the Biltmore rested on this foundation of organized invisibility, and recognizing that fact doesn't diminish the architecture but complicates it, makes it impossible to look at those magnificent rooms without wondering about the woman who cleaned them, whose name the family never learned, who spent the prime of her life maintaining beauty she was never meant to fully inhabit. The financial trajectory of the Biltmore over the 20th century traced a path from unsustainable private wealth to barely sustainable commercial operation. The transition preserved the physical structure but transformed its meaning entirely. George built a home. His descendants run a business. The distinction matters because homes are intimate and businesses are transactional, because the preservation that saved the Biltmore also killed what the Biltmore was supposed to be. The house survived by becoming its opposite, by sacrificing privacy and exclusivity to generate the revenue necessary for physical maintenance. The broader lesson about generational wealth is embedded in every stone of the Biltmore's walls. Fortunes that aren't actively managed and grown disappear within 3 generations, sometimes faster. The Vanderbilt fortune lasted barely a century despite starting from a position of almost unimaginable wealth. The mathematics are straightforward. If you have 10 children and divide your wealth equally, each inherits 1/10. If they each have 10 children, each grandchild inherits 1/100. 3 generations converts one fortune into 100 fragments, and if those fragments aren't being actively grown through investment or business activity, they shrink further through spending and taxation until they cease to be significant wealth at all. The Vanderbilts' failure, and calling it failure seems harsh but is financially accurate, came from treating wealth as a static resource to be divided and spent rather than a dynamic resource requiring management and growth. The generation that built the fortune understood this intuitively. The Commodore and William were obsessive about business, about growing their wealth, about active management. But George and most of his generation wanted to enjoy the wealth, to convert it into culture and beauty and lifestyle rather than continue the difficult work of business management. That choice is understandable, even admirable in some ways. Who wants to spend their entire life accumulating more money when they already have enough for 10 lifetimes? But the financial consequences were inevitable. The inheritance tax system that emerged in the early 20th century accelerated this process substantially. When George built the Biltmore, estate taxes were minimal. By the time of Edith's death in 1958, federal estate taxes could claim up to 77% of estates over $10 million. This meant that each generational transfer consumed the majority of remaining wealth, forcing asset sales and leaving heirs with dramatically reduced inheritances. The Biltmore survived partly because it was difficult to value and sell. Who wants to buy a 250-room mansion, which meant it often got passed through estates at relatively low valuations that reduced immediate tax burdens while postponing the reckoning? The question the Biltmore poses to contemporary audiences is whether preservation justifies transformation. Would George Vanderbilt prefer that his house survive as a tourist attraction or be demolished rather than commodified? The question has no answer. George is dead and left no instructions addressing this scenario, but it's worth asking because it reveals assumptions about what matters in preservation. Do we preserve buildings to maintain physical structures, or to maintain the meanings and purposes those structures originally served? If we save the architecture but destroy the function, have we preserved anything important or merely created an elaborate museum display? The Biltmore today succeeds commercially because it offers tourists access to a world they could never otherwise experience, a glimpse of how the ultra-wealthy lived during America's Gilded Age. The admission price is high enough to feel exclusive while low enough to be accessible to upper-middle-class families on vacation. The experience is carefully curated. Visitors see the magnificent public rooms, some of the bedrooms, the basement pool and bowling alley, but not the complete servant quarters, not the full infrastructure of invisibility that made the lifestyle possible. The interpretation emphasizes beauty and craftsmanship, occasionally acknowledges servant labor, but doesn't dwell too long on the uncomfortable questions about who paid what cost so that one man could live in a 250-room chateau. This editorial choice is understandable from a business perspective. Tourists want to be enchanted, not guilt-tripped, but it means the Biltmore's success as an attraction depends partly on continuing the pattern of selective visibility that characterized its original function. The beauty is highlighted. The cost is footnoted. The servants exist in interpretation but remain essentially invisible in the narrative, mentioned but not centered, acknowledged but not truly examined. The house preserves itself by preserving the same hierarchies of attention and visibility that structured its original operations. The ultimate question is whether there's a better way to engage with Gilded Age estates like the Biltmore. Can we appreciate the architecture and craftsmanship while also fully confronting the systems of labor exploitation and resource consumption they embodied? Can we hold both truths simultaneously, that these places are beautiful and that beauty was purchased through others' invisibility and exhaustion? Can we visit them without participating in the sanitization that makes them comfortable tourist attractions rather than complicated historical sites that should provoke as much discomfort as admiration? The answer requires visitors to do more work than typical tourism demands. It requires looking past the magnificent banquet hall to imagine Emma Reed cleaning it at dawn, requires thinking about the 1,000 construction workers when admiring the carved limestone, requires asking who heated the 43 bathrooms and cleaned the 65 fireplaces and maintained the 125,000 original acres. It requires refusing the seductive simplification that treats the Biltmore as merely beautiful rather than also troubling, refusing the comfortable narrative that celebrates Vanderbilt taste without examining Vanderbilt appetite and what feeding that appetite required from others. If this story changed how you see monuments to wealth, if it complicated the beauty with questions about cost and labor and sustainability, then something important happened here. Share this if you believe others should confront these complexities too, should see the invisible people and ask the uncomfortable questions that transform admiration into understanding. The Biltmore stands today as it has stood for over a century, pale limestone glowing in the Blue Ridge sunlight, towers and turrets rising above forests that have reclaimed much of the estate's original acreage. Tourists stream through its doors daily, approximately 3,000 per day during peak season, paying nearly $100 each for the privilege of walking through rooms where one family once lived in splendor that required 80 people working invisibly to maintain. The house has been preserved. The vision has been destroyed. And the question of whether that trade-off was worth it, whether physical preservation justifies functional transformation, remains open, debatable, unresolved. George Vanderbilt wanted to build something permanent, and in the narrowest sense he succeeded. The house still stands, still draws crowds, still impresses everyone who sees it. But in every other sense he failed. His vision of cultured wealthy families living for generations in beautiful isolation proved financially impossible. His belief that inherited wealth alone could sustain a lifestyle this expensive proved incorrect. His assumption that monuments could exist outside economic reality proved naive. The house survived only by becoming something he never intended, something he probably would have hated: a commercial operation, a tourist attraction, a place where strangers pay to gawk at what was supposed to be intensely private. The servants who made the Biltmore function have mostly vanished from memory, their names surviving in payroll ledgers but their stories largely lost. Emma Reed's oral history is exceptional only because it exists at all. Most left no trace beyond their names in employment records. They devoted years of their lives to maintaining beauty for others, to enabling luxury through their invisible labor, and their reward was wages that barely covered necessities and no acknowledgement of their contributions to what is now considered a historic treasure. The Biltmore is preserved as George Vanderbilt's achievement, not as the collective creation of thousands of workers whose names we'll never know. The financial lesson of the Biltmore applies far beyond one family's chateau. Wealth that isn't actively managed disappears. Asset allocation matters. Operating costs compound. Illiquid assets become anchors. Generational wealth requires either continued business success or extremely disciplined investment strategies, and even then, division across descendants means dramatic dilution. The Vanderbilts started with one of America's largest fortunes and lost it completely within a century. If it can happen to them, with every advantage and sophisticated financial advice, it can happen to anyone. The mathematics are unforgiving, and monuments don't generate returns, they consume capital until the capital is exhausted. The human lesson is simpler but harder: you can't build beauty on invisibility and expect it to remain beautiful once you notice the invisible people. You can't create luxury from exploitation and feel entirely comfortable enjoying it once you understand the exploitation. You can't construct monuments to yourself without wondering what was sacrificed to build them and whether the sacrifice was justified. The Biltmore is genuinely magnificent, and it was genuinely built on systems that treated human beings as implements rather than people. Both facts are true. Neither cancels the other. And wrestling with that contradiction, refusing to simplify it into comfortable conclusions, is the only honest way to engage with what places like the Biltmore represent. The morning mist still rolls across the Blue Ridge Mountains, still clings to the valleys, still burns away as the sun rises over the Biltmore's limestone walls. The house still stands, will stand for generations more if maintained. And somewhere in that house, in corridors tourists don't see, in basements and attics and service areas, the infrastructure of invisibility still exists, built into the architecture, designed deliberately, waiting for anyone willing to look past the beauty to see the machinery underneath, to notice who's missing from the photographs and whose stories aren't being told, and what it really cost to build a chateau in North Carolina and maintain it through a century of change, collapse, transformation, and complicated survival.